wife's best friend is secretly flirting behind my wife's back. Hello, everyone. I'm a longtime lurker here. I've been trying to share this story from a different account, but for reasons I can't explain, my posts kept disappearing. I'm hoping this finally goes through because I genuinely need help and clarity on what to do next. This is a part of my life I never imagined I would need to share with strangers on the internet. But here I am, reaching out to anyone who might listen. To start, my name is James. I'm 35 years old, and I've been married to my amazing wife, Sarah, who is 34. We've been together for almost 10 years now. We have a beautiful life together, filled with love and respect, even if it hasn't always been easy. Sarah and I don't have children yet, but we've built a stable, loving partnership that has carried us through thick and thin. Sarah's best friend, Amy, has been a fixture in her life for well over 15 years. They met in college, and it was during that time I first crossed paths with Amy as well. The two of them became inseparable, sisters in every sense of the word except blood. Amy supported Sarah through some challenging times, including helping her break free from an abusive household during her teenage years. Sarah has always felt a profound sense of gratitude and loyalty to Amy, a debt she believes she'll never be able to fully repay. It's that history between them that has, in many ways, shaped their unbreakable bond. And while I respect their closeness, I have my own complicated relationship with Amy. Amy and I have always had a somewhat rocky rapport. I won't lie. She's never been my favorite person. We've never argued outright or been openly hostile to one another. But there's an underlying tension that's hard to ignore. From my perspective, Amy is the type of person who dominates every space she enters. She's loud, outspoken, and frankly, entitled. She inserts herself into conversations and situations where she's neither wanted nor needed. At gatherings, she becomes the center of attention, whether people are interested in what she has to say or not. For the sake of my wife, I've always tried to be civil, even friendly, but there have been times when her behavior has truly tested my patience. One recent example sticks out in my mind like a thorn. A few months ago, my friend Max and I were having a private conversation at a dinner gathering. Max was sharing something deeply personal, confiding in me about the fertility struggles he and his wife were facing. We were speaking quietly enough that no one else at the table could hear us, or so we thought. Out of nowhere, Amy, sitting on the opposite side of the table, inserted herself into our conversation, loudly proclaiming that she'd kill herself if she couldn't have children, adding that it would be the ultimate failure as a woman. Her words were crass, completely out of place and hurtful, especially to Max, who was already struggling with his own feelings of inadequacy. Max and his wife were so upset by Amy's comment that they left the gathering early, retreating home in an awkward and pained silence. Incidents like these have solidified my view of Amy as someone who lacks a basic sense of empathy and boundaries. But up until recently, I would have considered these merely annoying or frustrating encounters. I never could have predicted how much worse things would get. Let me tell you about the night everything changed. Amy's boyfriend, Khalid, had recently ended their relationship, citing her abrasive personality as a primary reason. I suspect it was a long time coming for him, but apparently the final straw was when Amy chose not to feed their dog while Khalid was on a work trip. She did this to punish him because he had the audacity to fall asleep when she was calling him, drunk and wanting a ride home. Her reaction was, in my opinion, a petty and heartless move that hinted at something deeper about her character. But even then, I didn't anticipate that this breakup would lead to the nightmare that unfolded in my own home. Amy, freshly single and seemingly heartbroken, had been trying to reach out to me more frequently in the days following her breakup with Khalid. She'd DM me on Instagram, sharing gossip about our mutual friends or bringing up irrelevant, often trivial matters. I ignored her messages, not wanting to encourage anything beyond superficial pleasantries. Besides, it felt wrong. I've always been completely transparent with Sarah, and she knew Amy sometimes messaged me, but she'd never seen it as a red flag. In her eyes, Amy was incapable of malice or ill intent. That's the pedestal Sarah put her on, and I respected her loyalty to her best friend. Perhaps that was my mistake. Then, one night, Amy came over to our house, supposedly to visit Sarah. Sarah was feeling unwell that evening. She'd taken some medication to help her sleep off a bad headache, and within an hour of Amy's arrival, had drifted off into a deep sleep. As I glanced at Sarah resting on the couch, I considered asking Amy to leave, given that her reason for visiting was no longer relevant. However, she looked visibly upset, likely still reeling from the breakup, and I figured that for Sarah's sake, the best thing to do would be to let her stay the night. I suggested she could sleep in the guest room if she needed. Amy accepted, thanking me before heading to bed. As the night wore on, I found myself alone in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner. The house was quiet, and I thought Amy had already settled in for the night. But then, out of nowhere, she walked into the kitchen, startling me. My shock wasn't just from her sudden appearance. She was standing there wearing nothing but her undergarments. It was an image that felt entirely wrong, out of place in my own home and deeply uncomfortable. She put on a performance of surprise, claiming she hadn't realized I was still in the kitchen. I didn't know what to say or how to react, so I kept my tone casual and excused myself, deciding that this encounter needed to end here and now. But Amy didn't seem inclined to let me go. She looked at me with a glint in her eyes that I couldn't ignore, a look that was unmistakably suggestive. Then she started walking toward me, her expression a mixture of boldness and vulnerability. I took a step back, feeling a surge of discomfort as she continued to advance. Then, with a voice that was almost a whisper, she told me that my wife didn't need to know, that she'd seen the way I looked at her. In that moment, I was utterly shocked. Her words barely registered as my mind tried to make sense of the situation. I told her she had completely misread me, and that she should be ashamed of herself for betraying her best friend. I moved to leave the kitchen, but Amy intercepted me, placing herself directly in my path. Without warning, she reached out and touched me inappropriately. At that moment, panic and instinct took over, and without thinking, I swung at her, hitting her squarely in the face. The punch left her with a bruised eye, and she screamed loud enough to rattle the walls. Her wails echoed through the house, loud enough to rouse Sarah from her sleep. My wife stumbled into the kitchen, groggy and disoriented, only to find Amy, bruised, nearly naked, and visibly shaken, while I stood there, still reeling from the shock of it all. Amy wasted no time spinning her narrative, her voice shaking as she told Sarah that I had tried to rape her, painting me as a monstrous figure who'd taken advantage of her vulnerability. She cried out that I was a disgusting man, one that Sarah should immediately leave, claiming she could never be safe with me again. In a panic, I tried to explain, telling Sarah exactly what had happened, that Amy had come on to me, that I'd rejected her, and that my reaction was out of sheer desperation to make her stop. I could barely breathe as I shared my side, and the shame of the punch hung heavily in my words. But Sarah didn't respond. She was paralyzed, and then, as if her mind and body had reached their limit, she fainted, collapsing right there in the kitchen. My instincts kicked in, and I rushed to her side, lifting her into my arms and taking her to the hospital. All the way there, my heart raced with worry for her well-being, dread over what this meant for us, and a gnawing fear of what might come next. Update? However, there's another side to this that I feel compelled to address. A number of people commented, suggesting that this story couldn't possibly be real, calling it fabricated or some twisted fantasy. I assure you, none of this is exaggerated or invented. This is my life, and right now, it's falling apart. I haven't slept more than a few hours in total since the incident, and eating is out of the question. My mind is consumed by the betrayal, the fear of losing my wife, and the dread of my reputation being tarnished. I am living a nightmare I wouldn't wish on anyone. Some messages suggested something else disturbing, that I should have gone along with Amy's advances, and others even accused me of being a sicko for my reaction. To those people, I hope you find the peace and clarity you need to reflect on your words and actions. And to the handful of commenters who labeled me the bad guy in this scenario, I genuinely hope you treat the people in your life with more empathy and respect than you've shown here. I don't regret standing up for myself or for my marriage, but this situation has brought out sides of people I never anticipated. Now, on to the update. A lot happened over the next 9 hours. While I was scrolling through the comments, one of you suggested I reach out to Amy's ex-boyfriend, Khalid, to get a sense of her patterns of behavior. I hadn't even considered that he might have insights that could help my situation, but I realized it was a solid suggestion, so I decided to go for it. Reaching out to him felt like a last resort, a Hail Mary. But to my surprise, Khalid responded immediately, and he sounded every bit as traumatized by Amy's behavior as I was. Our conversation opened a floodgate of revelation. Khalid admitted that this wasn't the first time Amy had weaponized accusations of assault. According to him, she had once threatened to accuse him of rape if he ever tried to leave her. He described feeling trapped, walking on eggshells, fearful that at any moment she could tear his life apart. He managed to avoid that nightmare by secretly installing cameras around their home and hiring a lawyer, ready to defend himself if things ever escalated. It was a grim strategy, but it worked, and Khalid eventually escaped the relationship, though clearly scarred by the ordeal. Hearing this, I felt both a wave of horror and a strange sense of relief. Maybe I wasn't the first, and maybe there was a way to clear my name. With renewed resolve, I decided to confront Amy directly, armed with Khalid's revelations and the knowledge that her story was riddled with inconsistencies. I didn't want this situation spiraling further out of control, especially within our friend group, where opinions were already divided. When I confronted Amy, I calmly laid out the numerous holes in her story and reminded her of Khalid's experiences. I mentioned the existence of evidence he still had on her, and that I would not hesitate to involve legal action if she didn't stop spreading falsehoods. My approach seemed to rattle her. She was visibly shaken, almost as if she hadn't anticipated that I would take such decisive action. Finally, she broke down. In a teary voice, she admitted that she hadn't been in her right mind after her breakup with Khalid, and that her accusations against me were in fact baseless. She apologized, though it felt hollow, as if she were more focused on the potential consequences for herself than on the damage she'd inflicted on my life and marriage. I pressed further, demanding that she come clean to our entire friend group. Reluctantly, she agreed, and in a group chat, she confessed that her accusations had been lies. After that, she left the chat and cut off contact with everyone, effectively disappearing from our social circle. It was as if she'd gone into hiding, and I can't say I was disappointed. That confession was a victory in some ways, but it left me feeling strangely hollow. The damage was already done. My reputation may have been salvaged among our friends, but my marriage was hanging by a thread. When I finally told my wife what had happened, she admitted that she had seen the confession in the group chat. She confessed to me that during those dark hours, she had genuinely contemplated divorce, uncertain of whom to believe. Hearing that broke something deep within me. I had hoped that my character, my loyalty, and our 10 years together would have been enough for her to believe me without hesitation. I shared my disappointment with her, not to hurt her, but to be honest about how shaken I felt. I told her that after everything we had been through as a couple, I would have expected her to trust me. She looked at me with an expression that mixed regret with sadness, explaining that her disbelief wasn't because she thought I was capable of such a terrible act, but because she had known Amy for so long. She admitted she couldn't reconcile the idea that her friend of 15 years could be so deceptive and cruel. I spent that night in the guest room, trying to make sense of everything. Although I knew that my wife's loyalty to Amy was based on years of friendship and even a sense of indebtedness, it didn't lessen the sting. My marriage had been profoundly shaken, and I was left questioning where to go from here. Sarah has stood by Amy in various disagreements we'd had over the years, always choosing to forgive Amy's faults. But this was different. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a petty argument. This was a deliberate attack that almost tore our marriage apart. The following day, Sarah tried to reach out, but I found myself struggling to be as open with her as I'd been in the past. Part of me wanted to bridge the distance, but another part of me couldn't shake the disappointment and the hurt. She had been willing to contemplate divorce over a single accusation, even if it was from her trusted friend. I couldn't help but wonder, how strong was our bond if she was willing to let it unravel so easily? Days went by, and I tried to move forward, to convince myself that we could overcome this. But there was a lingering ache, a shadow that hung over everything. I'd put all my trust in my wife, but I didn't feel as though I'd received the same in return when it mattered most. Sarah sensed the distance too, and she tried to assure me that she understood my pain, though it was clear she still struggled to view Amy as the villain. She dismissed her friend's actions as a mistake, attributing it to the emotional trauma of her breakup. But to me, this was no mere mistake. It was a betrayal of the highest order. I tried to talk to her about how traumatizing the incident had been for me, but she brushed it off, suggesting I was overreacting, or worse, that I needed to move on. She failed to understand, or perhaps refused to see, the deep scar this left on me. At times, she even laughed it off, as if I could just erase the impact of Amy's lies with a shrug. She wasn't just minimizing the situation, she was trivializing my pain. Each day, I found myself more and more uncertain of our future. Could I truly move forward with someone who hadn't shown me the same faith I'd shown her? I loved her deep, but there was now a wound in my heart that felt impossible to heal. Sarah continued to downplay the severity of what happened, preferring to dismiss it as a misunderstanding. But this wasn't something I could move past so easily. Her reluctance to fully acknowledge Amy's role only deepened the divide between us. It's been a little over 2 months since that night shattered my sense of security and trust. These last 8 weeks have been a storm of emotions I can barely put into words. I felt everything from intense betrayal and confusion to despair and, at times, a hollow numbness. Through it all, I tried my best to salvage my marriage, hoping that time, effort, and patience would mend the rift that had opened between me and my wife. I wanted to believe that if I could just hold on, if I could give her space and forgive her disbelief, maybe things would return to something resembling normalcy. But the reality of trying to move on was far from simple. Each day brought new reminders of how deeply the incident had affected me, and how oblivious, or perhaps unwilling, my wife was to acknowledge that impact. Although Amy had confessed her lie to our friend group, and some semblance of the truth had been reestablished, it felt like I was the only one who truly understood the weight of what had happened. My wife had treated the confession as little more than a footnote, something to acknowledge briefly and then tuck away, out of sight and mind. For her, Amy's confession had resolved the problem, as if my hurt and trauma could be so easily dismissed. For me, though, that night was still an open wound. In those 2 months, I tried desperately to bury the resentment and anger that kept bubbling up every time Amy's name came up. I didn't want to feel this way toward my wife, the person I had shared my life with for a decade, but each time she casually mentioned hanging out with Amy, as if her betrayal had never happened. It felt like a slap in the face. I found myself questioning everything. Her loyalty, her priorities, and even her ability to truly empathize with what I'd endured. Each time she shared her excitement about spending time with Amy, it was as though she was forcing me to relive that night, to confront the same lack of understanding and support that had hurt me so deeply. And then came the final straw. A few days ago, as we were sitting together in the living room, she began animatedly telling me about her upcoming plans with Amy. They were planning a trip together, she said. A 2-week summer getaway to Greece. She spoke about it with a glimmer in her eyes, as if it were some long-awaited adventure she had been dreaming of. She mentioned beaches, sunsets, cocktails, and all the relaxation she was looking forward to. Then she added, with a sigh of relief, that she couldn't wait to finally take a break from life's stresses. She didn't seem to notice or care that her words struck me like a blow. I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process what she had just said. My mind raced, replaying everything we had been through over the last 2 months, all the pain and turmoil that had weighed on my heart. A break from life's stresses? Was she oblivious to the fact that she was part of the stress I had been dealing with? Did she not realize that planning a trip with the very person who had nearly destroyed our marriage was like pouring salt into my wounds? I bit back my initial impulse to lash out, trying to keep my emotions in check, but something in me finally snapped, and I couldn't hold it in any longer. I turned to her, my voice shaking as I struggled to convey the depth of my hurt. "How can you even think about going on a vacation with her?" I asked, the words barely more than a whisper. "Do you even understand what you're saying to me? You're acting like she didn't just try to ruin our marriage, like she didn't accuse me of assault and nearly destroy my life, and now you're excitedly telling me about a vacation with her, as if none of that ever happened?" She looked taken aback, as though she hadn't expected me to react this way. For a moment, I saw a flicker of discomfort in her eyes, but it quickly faded as she composed herself. She took a deep breath and looked at me with an expression that was both exasperated and dismissive. "Why are you still holding on to this?" she asked, almost impatiently. "It was just a misunderstanding, a bad situation that we're past now. I don't understand why you can't just get over it. Amy and I have been friends for 15 years. I can't throw that away over one mistake." Her words hit me like a hammer. A mistake? That's all she saw this as? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She had been willing to believe Amy's accusation without question, to the point where she had even considered divorce. And now, when it came to my trauma, my betrayal, she had the audacity to suggest that I should just get over it? I felt a surge of emotions, anger, sadness, disbelief, swirl within me. "This isn't something you can just sweep under the rug," I told her, my voice trembling. "Amy's accusation could have destroyed me. It nearly ended our marriage, and it's still affecting us, whether you choose to see it or not. And yet you're willing to put my feelings aside just to maintain a friendship with someone who would stoop so low?" She rolled her eyes as if she couldn't believe I was still bringing this up. "I don't understand why you're making this such a big deal," she said, her tone cold. "You're acting like she's some kind of monster. She was just going through a tough time." In that moment, I knew we had reached an impasse. Her refusal to see the situation from my perspective, her insistence on minimizing my pain and making excuses for Amy, left me feeling completely alone. I realized that, to her, my feelings and my trust were secondary to maintaining her friendship. This wasn't the woman I thought I had married, the woman I had believed would stand by me no matter what. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of my decision settle over me. "I can't do this anymore," I said, my voice barely audible. "I can't keep pretending that everything's okay when you're so willing to overlook what happened. I tried to make this work, I really did. But if you can't even acknowledge what I went through, then maybe this isn't going to work out." For the first time, I saw a look of panic in her eyes. She stood up, reaching for me, as though finally realizing the gravity of my words. "Are you serious?" she asked, her voice shaking. "You're really going to leave me over this, after everything we've been through?" "Yes," I said, feeling a strange calm wash over me, "because I need to be with someone who respects me, who believes in me, and who doesn't dismiss my pain. And right now, that's not you." She began to cry, pleading with me to reconsider, insisting that I was overreacting and that we could work this out. But her words felt empty, like too little, too late. For weeks, she had ignored my feelings, dismissed my pain, and continued her friendship with the person who had tried to ruin my life. Now, faced with the prospect of losing me, she suddenly wanted to talk, but it wasn't enough. I had reached my breaking point, and there was no going back. I packed a bag that night and checked into a hotel, needing space to clear my head and decide my next steps. Her family and friends have been blowing up my phone ever since, alternating between begging me to come home and accusing me of abandoning. But I feel a strange sense of peace, even amidst the chaos. I finally stood up for myself and refused to let her disregard my feelings any longer. As I sit here in this quiet hotel room, away from the chaos that my life has turned into. I am forced to reckon with the finality of my choices and the life I am about to leave behind. A few days ago, I made a decision that was as heartbreaking as it was inevitable. I told my wife we were getting a divorce. For months, I had fought to salvage what was left of our relationship, to rekindle a trust that was deeply fractured. But each effort had been met with dismissal, indifference, or an insistence that I move on as if my pain were something trivial, an inconvenience to her plans. When I walked away from her that final time, there was a profound clarity. I knew I had given all I could, and in the end, I could not ignore the painful truth. My wife didn't see or respect my trauma, nor did she recognize the gravity of Amy's betrayal. For her, our history with Amy held more weight than my suffering, and that was something I simply couldn't accept. As she pleaded, shouted, and threw things in desperation, I felt a strange calm wash over me. I wasn't the one causing this chaos. I was finally reclaiming my sense of self. Since that night, her family has been relentless, calling and texting, urging me to reconsider. Some messages have been angry, accusing me of abandoning her when she's in such pain. Others are more subdued, asking me to come back and work things out. But none of these pleas make mention of what I've endured. Not one of them acknowledges that I was nearly destroyed by a false accusation, that I was betrayed by both my wife and her best friend. Their concern is for her, and I can see now how deeply ingrained her tendency to dismiss my trauma truly is. It's all she's ever known, and that's not something I can change. One of the most shocking things to come out of this entire ordeal has been learning about my wife's alleged activity on social media, and more specifically, her apparent search for sugar daddies on Reddit. I couldn't believe it when I first read the comments. This felt like a twisted fever dream. It was hard to reconcile this with the woman I had spent 10 years of my life, but the possibility of this being true only added another layer to the heartache. I had thought my relationship was built on a solid foundation of loyalty and mutual respect, but in the end, it seems I had been living in a fragile illusion, one that shattered all too easily. After reading these unsettling revelations, I decided to return to the house to collect my things and initiate the divorce proceeding. It was a sobering, almost surreal experience. The place that had been my sanctuary, my safe haven, now felt like an alien environment, filled with memories that no longer brought comfort, but rather a bittersweet ache. My wife was there when I arrived, looking exhausted, her eyes red and puffy from crying. She tried to engage with me, to apologize, to explain that she never meant to hurt me, but her words felt empty, like they were spoken from a script she thought would bring me back, not from genuine. When she tried to talk about the alleged sugar daddy posts, she insisted it was all ridiculous, a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by strangers on the internet. But I couldn't believe her, not anymore. Too many boundaries had been crossed, too much trust had been eroded. Her words, her reassurances, none of them could erase the scars left behind by her dismissals and betrayal. At that moment, I knew that reconciliation was impossible, that any attempt to rebuild would be like stacking blocks on top of sand, destined to collapse at the slightest tremor. I told her as calmly as I could that it was over, and that any further communication would need to go through my lawyer. She begged, she cried, and at one point, she even tried to initiate physical intimacy, as if that could somehow erase the months of pain and the wounds she had inflicted. But I stayed firm, repeating that this was the end, that I could no longer ignore the fundamental lack of respect and empathy she had shown. Finally, in a moment of desperation, she lashed out, calling me heartless, saying I was giving up on us. But I knew in my heart that I wasn't giving. I was choosing myself, my sanity, and my dignity over a marriage that had become toxic and unsustainable. As I packed my belongings, there was a sense of closure that I hadn't felt in months. It was as though I was finally able to lay to rest the hopes and dreams I had once held for our future together. I could see now that my marriage had become a prison of expectations and dismissals, one where my pain was invalidated and my worth diminished. Walking away wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I knew that I deserved more than what I had been given, that a relationship built on love also needed to be rooted in respect and trust, two things that had been irrevocably broken.